So just a quick introduction about me, because a lot of people perhaps don't know me. My name is Tim Costelloe. I'm the Archbishop of Perth. I've been there for getting on for 6 years in March. Before that, I was an auxiliary bishop in Melbourne. And before that, I'm a Salesian, and I was involved in the... Yes, good to see the Salesian family here. I was involved in the formation of young men who were training to be Salesian brothers and priests. And I just had the joy last weekend of going down to Melbourne, pardon me, and ordaining 3 young Salesians as deacons, so that was terrific. So I'm here to talk about the gift of the young church, and when I was putting this material together, and even more over the last few days, I thought to myself, it's really a bit superfluous, this topic. Because I can talk about the gift of the young church, but we've actually been living the gift of the young church for the last 3 days. So in a sense, you're the people who should be telling me all about what the young church is all about. But the thing that I wanted to start with is just to get you to recognise that you have actually been living the reality of what this topic is supposed to be all about. The gift of the young church. So I think it's important to have that background in our minds as I just share with you some of the thoughts that I put together about this topic. The first thing that occurred to me was just to get us to think a little bit about the idea of gift, because the topic is the gift of the young church. And I think it's important for us to reflect a little bit on the idea of gift. And as I thought about it, it occurred to me that you could say these are really obvious things, but a gift is something that is freely given. A genuine gift, a gift that's really worthwhile, is a gift that is given by somebody because he or she wants to give it. There's something moving in the heart of the person who gives the gift, and it's something that is free and rising up within them, and then it's offered to somebody else who can either receive it or not receive it. And I wanted you to think about the idea that the gift of the young church, before it's, let's say, the gift of young people to the church, it's actually the gift of God to the church. You are the gift of God to the church. And what that means is that something, if we can use human language, something has moved within the heart of God who wants to give this gift to his people. That's true of the church as a whole. And I think one of the things that's really important for us these days when, it's not easy to belong to the church, there's all sorts of difficulties that the church is going through at the moment, it's good to remember that while all of that's true, it doesn't alter the fact that at its heart, the church is God's gift to us. And so this desire within the heart of God to give us this gift then is offered to us, and it's up to us to decide what we're going to do with the gift. And usually, if you think about, we're only a couple of weeks away from Christmas, no doubt you're all thinking about gifts you want to give to your parents, to your friends, to the people that you care about. If you think about the reasons that motivate you to give a gift, to think about the kind of gift that you want to give, I just jotted down a few thoughts myself. And often I think a gift that's a genuine gift is a sign of affection. If you give a gift because you're expected to, or even forced to, it really doesn't have much value. But if you give a gift because you care about the person, you want to make that person happy, you want to make that person's life a bit richer, then that's the motivation for a genuine gift. So it's a sign of affection, or maybe of esteem, that you really admire someone and you want to have a way of showing how much you admire them, so you give them something. A gift of recognition that someone's done something really worthwhile that you think is worth acknowledging, and so you give them a gift to say thank you. And most of all, of course, a gift is a sign of love. So one of the things I wanted to say to you this morning is that this gift of the church is a gift to us from God because God has a great affection for us, because God has real esteem for us, because God loves us. And I think it's important that we approach the idea of the church in this way, that the church is a gift. And before it's a gift that we give anybody, or a gift that young people give the rest of the members of the church or whatever, the church is a gift from God to us. And the other thing I wanted to say is that there's no such thing as the young church, or the old church, or the Australian church, or the church in Sydney, or any of those sorts of things. There's only the church. And young people have absolutely the same right to claim the church as a gift that you've been given as anybody else. So a really important thing for me to say to you, and you've experienced it all over the last couple of days, is that this church is a place that you have a right to belong to. It's yours as much as it's mine as a bishop, or Pope Francis's, or your parents, or your teachers, or anybody else's. It's your church. And it's your church because it's God's church and God's giving it to you as a gift. So one of the things I hope at the end of the festival, at the end of these few days, is that you think about the fact that this is mine. I'm at home in this thing that we call the church because it's been given to me as surely as it's been given to anybody else. But I think that then invites us to ask the question, well, what is this thing that we call the church? What is this thing that every single one of us here in the hall this morning is a vital part of, or is invited to be a vital part of? And to do that, I wanted to just talk about two ideas. One comes from Pope John Paul II, and the other comes from Pope Francis. The second one, the one from Pope Francis, is one that you will have heard a few times over the course of these few days. The first one, maybe not so much. Both of them, in the end, remind us that before the church is anything else, the church is about Jesus. And those of you who are from Perth know that this is my big theme in life, that Jesus has got to be at the heart of everything. So let me just talk about these couple of ideas. And the first one is something that John Paul used to often say. John Paul was Pope for a long time, and he wrote lots of documents, and he gave lots of speeches and homilies and all the rest of it. He talked a lot about the church in all sorts of different ways, but one of his most favourite expressions to describe the church was up there on the screen. The church is the community of the disciples of Christ. And each of those three terms is really important. The church is our community. The church isn't just a kind of a coming together of a whole lot of isolated individuals who somehow or other link up with each other. There's something much deeper about the church. It's a community. And a community forms when people have a sense that they belong to each other. That, if you like, they're responsible for each other. That they can depend on each other. So one of the things that's, I think, not unique to the Catholic way of looking at things, but it's pretty characteristic of the Catholic way of looking at things, is that our faith is about us together finding our way to God. It's not just about me having my personal, cosy, private relationship with the Lord. It's about all of us together helping each other to find our way to God. So it's a community. It's about communion. It's about belonging, with all that goes with this idea of belonging. But it's a community that's different from lots of other communities because it's a community of disciples. Now, disciples are people who know that they have to look beyond themselves to someone else. Disciples are people that they know they have lots to learn, and they've got to find a teacher who's going to help them learn what will help them live their lives to the full. A disciple is someone who's following in someone else's footsteps. Now, this is a really important thing because communities can easily fall into the trap of kind of becoming really inward-looking. But we as a community shouldn't be inward-looking, we should be outward-looking, And while people often think that means looking out into the world and seeing what needs to be done in the world, and it does, first of all, it means looking beyond ourselves to the Lord, to Jesus. He's the one we're following. He's the one that we're trying to learn from. He's the one that we want to take as our guide to a rich and happy and full life. And of course, we're disciples of Jesus, of Christ. So this is what the church is all about. And whether it's the young people in the church, or the old people in the church, or the well people in the church, or the sick people in the church, it doesn't matter. It's all of us together who are forming a community of people who know they've got to look beyond themselves to the Lord, because He's the one we're following. One of the things that has struck me over the last few days is that this has come through over and over and over again, and particularly in so much of the music that we've listened to or been a part of. So much of that music is pointing us away from ourselves to the Lord. And I think that's a really key thing. So that's the first idea, that the church is a community of the disciples of Christ, and we've got St. John Paul to thank for that. The second is the one that you will have heard a bit about this week, this famous quote of Pope Francis, that the church in our time, particularly in our world, needs to be a healer of wounds and a warmer of hearts. I'll just leave that slide there for a minute because there's some very fine-looking Perth people up in one of those photos, so I'll be in trouble if I move over too quickly. Anyway, you've had a chance to look at that. We're disciples of Christ. We're following Jesus. And I think that, as I said, is a really important thing. When Pope Francis described the church as a healer of wounds and a warmer of hearts, what I think he was tapping into was exactly the same thing that John Paul II was tapping into. Because if you pick up the Gospels and you read through the Gospels, what you'll find is that the man who emerges from the pages of these Gospels is a healer of people's wounds and a warmer of people's hearts. We won't go through a whole lot of the stories now, we don't have time. But every single one of you here would be able, I'm sure, to immediately think of some stories from the Gospels where Jesus is a healer of people's wounds. And Jesus is a warmer of people's hearts. Think about the story of the woman caught in adultery. She's dragged in front of all of these people and embarrassed and humiliated. And the first thing that Jesus says to her is, I don't condemn you. What could be more heartwarming for a woman who'd been persecuted and ridiculed and ostracised and embarrassed than for someone to say to her, I don't condemn you. The Gospels are full of these stories of this man Jesus who healed people's wounds and warmed people's hearts. And if we're going to be a community of his disciples, then obviously we're walking in his footsteps, so we've got to be people who heal the wounds of others and warm the hearts of others. And maybe a question that each of you could take back as an individual, but particularly back to your own local community, is how can we as a community of disciples in my parish or in my youth group or whatever it is, how can we be healers, first of all, of each other's wounds, and then warmers of each other's hearts? And as that starts to happen, we'll find that we're able to do it for wider and wider circles of people. So this is what the church is. And when we talk about the gift of the church, the gift of God who gives us the church, and therefore the gift of the church to the world, this is what it's for. It's so that Jesus can be present in our world, healing people's wounds and warming people's hearts. But I've been asked to talk about the gift of the young church. And I think what I simply want to say to you is that everything I'm saying is particularly true, not uniquely true, but particularly true to young people who have found their way, who knows how, into the church and are maybe trying to find a place for themselves in the church. That's a gift the Lord is giving you. And as you receive it, you then become the Lord's gift to everybody else. So we receive the gift in order to become the gift so that we can then share the gift with others. Maybe that's a simple way of explaining what the word evangelisation means. We receive the gift. We accept it. We allow it to take root and grow in our lives. We become the gift, and then we offer the gift to others. But we always need to remember that this church, first and foremost, is the Lord's church. You know, as a bishop, I visit lots of parishes, and people talk to me about our parish and our parish priest and our programs and everything like that, and that's all true. But I always say to them, just remember, before it's your parish, it's God's parish. Before it's your youth group, it's the Lord's youth group. Before it's your church or our church, it's His church. And I think that's a really important thing as we try to understand what this gift is. St. Paul would put it this way. He would say that Christ is the head of his body, the church. And it doesn't take much imagination if I were to invite Anita to come up here and whip out my sword and cut off her head. That'd be the end of it. You're not going to have much life if your head's been removed. Well, that's true for the church. If we don't remember whose church it is, where the life of the church comes from fundamentally, then we're in a lot of trouble. So just remember that. It is our church. We're proud of it. Sometimes we're embarrassed by it. Sometimes we're angry about things in it. It is our church, but before that, it's the Lord's church. He's the boss. He's the head. He's the one we're following. Some years ago, the Superior General of the Salesians, we call him the Rector Major, the Superior General of the Salesians, which is the order to which I belong, was the president of the Major Superiors organisation for men's religious orders all around the world. And he gave them a talk once, and he was talking about religious life, but I want to expand it to the church. And he said something that, when I first read it, it really bowled me over, and it's become a kind of a driving thing for me ever since. He said, and he was talking, remember, to men who were living lives of commitment and dedication to the church and to God's people. So probably thinking of themselves as, you know, we're doing a good job, we might not be perfect, but we're on the right track and we've got our hearts in the right place. He said to them, the greatest challenge facing the religious life today is to return Christ to the religious life and return the religious life to Christ. And I think we can say that about our church, about God's church. The greatest challenge facing the church today, which means the greatest challenge facing your diocese or your parish or your youth group or your religious congregation or whatever it is, the greatest challenge is to put Christ back where he belongs, at the heart of the church. And to give the church back to him, to give your parish back to him, to give your religious organisation back to him. Now, in theory, that's the way it is. I've just said that Christ's the head of his body, the church. But in practice, is that how we conduct our day-to-day lives in the church? Is that how your leadership team in your youth group conducts itself in its day-to-day thinking and its day-to-day organisation? Is it all about keeping your eyes fixed on Jesus, knowing he's the one we're following, he's the one who is leading us forward, and we're doing everything to make sure that it's very obvious and explicit and clear and unmistakable that before anything else, Jesus is at the heart of everything. And I think, and the last 3 days have confirmed it for me here at the festival in Sydney, that this is a particular challenge and a particular gift that young people can give the church. Because I think you have an instinct that this is really the most important thing. All the other things, the rules and the regulations and the doctrines, they're all important, don't get me wrong, I think they're all very important, but they're never going to make sense to anybody, and they're never going to give you any life and sustain you if you don't, first of all, see them through the prism of Jesus as that being at the heart of everything. The church is the community of the disciples of Christ. And the gift of the young church, I hope, is that you can help the rest of us to remember that, not just by what you say, but by the way you conduct yourselves within your experience of the church. Whether it's in a great big thriving parish where there's heaps of young people, or a small parish where you might be the only young person who ever goes to Mass, or whatever, if you can just help the rest of us remember, put Jesus at the centre of everything. And then I think we'll be on the right track as far as the church is concerned. That's all very well, and I think it's very important, and I say it because I believe it, but I also am very aware that I'm talking in a sense, about the ideal. And the ideal is one thing, and the reality is often something quite different. And I would imagine, I don't know how many people are here this morning listening to this, but as many people as there are here would probably be able to give a slightly different answer to the question that's up there on the screen. Where am I actually at the moment in my journey of faith, in my journey into the church, in my understanding of what it means to belong to the church? Maybe I'm here at the festival because I've had a deep experience of faith somewhere along the line, and it's that's brought me here. Or maybe I'm here because the faith is important to mum and dad and they put a bit of pressure on me to go along. Or maybe I'm here because I've got a few questions that I was hoping I might find some answers to. Or maybe I'm here because I just like the energy that I find in youth groups around the church these days, and I'm curious to know how I can tap into that and be a part of it. Every single one of us is going to be somewhere different on this journey of faith, and that's just the way it's supposed to be. So don't be judging yourself by anybody else and saying, look at that guy, or look at that girl, they're so holy, or they're so committed, or they're so engaged, and I'm not. Just accept that where you are at the moment is the reality, and that's what you've got to work with, and that's where you begin from. But this journey will always be a journey into something that's bigger than us, something that's mysterious, something that kind of invites us to go a bit further, to go a bit deeper. And it will always be a journey towards a destination rather than the destination. Because we get to the destination when we get to heaven. And all the way along, we're still on the journey. So if you've got questions and you've got doubts and you've got queries and you're not sure, that's fine, because we're all in the same boat. We're all on the journey, we're all moving forward, but the important thing is we're moving forward in the footsteps of Jesus. So maybe one of the questions to ask yourself, and maybe even now on Saturday, you'd give a different answer to the answer you might have given on Thursday. Do I see myself as part of this gift of the young church? Have I sort of caught a glimpse of where I might actually belong in this great big thing that we call the Catholic Church? I hope that you have, and I hope that that question might continue to play around in your minds and in your hearts. I mentioned just briefly before that we are part of the church is God's gift to us, that for many of us, we love the church, we care about the church. For many of us, however, we're disappointed in so many of the things that we see in the life of the church at the moment, maybe a bit scandalised or demoralised or discouraged or whatever. And we might think that we ought to scrap it all and start again. But I just wanted to add this one little thought before I go on to the next point I wanted to make. And it's based really on the story of St. Francis of Assisi. Of course, St. Francis is the one whose name Pope Francis took when he was elected as Pope. Francis of Assisi was a young person, probably similar age to many of you. He was living in sort of the central part of Italy in the 11th, 12th, 13th century, around that time. He'd come home quite sick after being captured as a prisoner in one of those internal wars that used to go on between the different towns and villages in Italy. He came home to his family and he was recovering from this illness. And he used to go for wanders through the bush in that part of Italy, and he came across an old chapel that was falling apart. The roof was missing, the walls were starting to crumble down, and he went in anyway, and on the wall, there's an image of it there, on the wall there was a crucifix, and you will have sometimes, some of you, seen copies of this crucifix before. And as Francis is in there, and he's going through many of the same sorts of issues and questions you are, trying to work out, where do I fit in all of this? Who is God? What's this all about? He had this experience as if the figure on the cross, Jesus, was talking to him. And he heard, whether he heard it in his ears or in his heart, who knows, but he heard the words, "Go and rebuild my church, because it's falling into ruins." And he must have been a bit of a literalist, young Francis, because he looked around and he saw this half-ruined church and he thought God was telling him he wanted to get out his bricks and mortar and start to rebuild the church. And that's what he did. He started to rebuild that physical chapel. But eventually, he started to understand that what he was supposed to be doing was, through his life of commitment and faith and generosity, he was being called to help renew the church, to rebuild the church. Not to tear it down, as if to tear down the crumbling chapel and start from scratch, but to rebuild the church, renew the church. That's what we need today. We don't need a new church. There is only the one church. It's the church Jesus started. It's the church he gave us. It's the church we still got today. We don't need a new church, but we need a renewed church. And I think this is the gift that young people can offer to the rest of the church. And I say that because I think that one of the things that young people bring, hopefully some of the older people do too, but certainly young people bring, is energy and joy and idealism and hope. And as I have moved around over the last 3 days, I've seen all of those things very much present here at the Youth Festival. Energy and joy and idealism and hope. That's part of the gift of the young church. Somebody who has embodied that for us and whom many of you would know about and perhaps are quite interested in is a fellow who's been beatified by John Paul II, I think it was, and his name is Pier Giorgio Frassati. Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati. And this is what he once said. Young guy. He died, I think, when he was 24. There are lots of things about Pier Giorgio Frassati we should emulate. That's not one of them. We don't want you all dying at the age of 24. But the point is that even by the time he got to 24 and his life was over, he'd already achieved extraordinary things. This is one of the things he said. To live without faith, without something to defend, without a steady struggle for truth, that's not living, that's existing. To live, I think all of this calls for enormous courage. It calls for the willingness to take a risk. It calls for the determination to give everything. And as you'll see up on the screen there, beside the image of the girl climbing up the rock, is the image of Jesus on the cross, where his disciples remember, and that's what he did. He gave everything. Pier Giorgio Frassati gave everything. So the willingness to take a risk, the courage to give everything. That's what we in the church all need from each other, and what you as young people, I think, can offer us precisely because of your energy and your joy and your enthusiasm and your, what was the other one? I've forgotten now. Hope. Thank you. Well done. Pier Giorgio Frassati, of course, is not the only young person who gives us this sort of example. And seeing as we're talking about the gift of the young church, I thought I would just very briefly mention some other young people who have been extraordinary in terms of courage and hope and enthusiasm and joy. I'm going to talk about 6 or 7 of them just very briefly. You might want to hop onto Google and check them out yourselves for a bit more information about them. They also all died young. So once again, let's follow them in lots of things. Let's not necessarily follow them in that. But the point about it is that you don't have to get old in order to achieve something wonderful. Young people, you have within you the ability to be amongst the great heroes and heroines of the Christian story, as these people that I'm going to briefly mention now were. The first up there is beatified. Her name is Chiara Badano. She was born in 1971. She died in 1990. 19 years old. She died of an aggressive bone cancer. In a sense, she was just a very ordinary, everyday young Catholic girl living in Italy. When she was dying, a priest went to visit her in hospital. She was very close to death. And the priest said to her, "The light in your eyes is splendid. Where does it come from?" So this girl, 19, on the verge of death, there was something about her that just shone out of her eyes. And the priest said to her, "Where's this coming from?" And her answer was very simple. She said, "I just try to love Jesus as much as I can." Isn't it amazing to think? It goes back to what I said before about putting Jesus back at the heart of everything. If you put Jesus at the heart of your life, it's extraordinary what you can deal with and how you can manage the things that come along in your life. So Chiara Badano, have a look for her on the internet at some stage. Pier Giorgio Frassati, I've already mentioned him. He died at the age of 24. He caught polio while he was helping the people, the poor people in his hometown of Turin in northern Italy. And many of you would know that he was a man who's remembered as being full of life, full of energy, loved mountain climbing, a great sportsman, but also someone who had Jesus at the heart of his understanding of what life was all about. When I was thinking about this, I was reminded of something that St. Teresa of Avila once said. And this might make sense for some of you. She said, "May God save me from gloomy-faced saints." Being a saint, being someone who has a place for God at the heart of your life, isn't meant to make you miserable, isn't meant to make you boring, isn't meant to make you sad. It's meant to bring you alive. And if it's not bringing you alive, then we're missing something. So Pier Giorgio Frassati, another one to keep in mind. Or Maria Busoni. She was born in 1954, pretty good year. Lots of very good people were born in 1954. And she died at the age of only 16. And she had a very tragic death, but she was just an ordinary teenage girl. And in one sense you might think this sounds funny, but of course it's not funny, it's tragic. She died because she was using a faulty electric hairdryer and she was electrocuted. Imagine the tragedy for her family that she should die like that. 16. And she once said to one of her friends, "I want to let God use me as he wishes." That's the really only worthwhile thing in life. 16 years old. and she already knew what the most important and worthwhile thing in life is. Or the one in the middle, Dominic Savio, went to this school run by St. John Bosco, the founder of the Salesians. The Salesians are actually a little bit cross with Pope Francis because Pope Francis canonised Jacinta and Francisco, and they took the crown from Dominic Savio because until then he was the youngest person ever to be canonised a saint who hadn't died as a martyr. So we're happy about Jacinta and Francisco, but we're just a little bit cross with Pope Francis. But Dominic Savio, he died at the age of 15, just close to his 16th birthday. He died of TB, which in those days was a disease that couldn't easily be cured. And he went to the school of St. John Bosco, and one of the things that St. John Bosco used to say to the kids in his school was, here in this school, we make holiness consist in being happy. How simple is that? All you have to do is be happy in order to be holy, in order to become a saint. But it's got to be the right kind of happiness, of course. One of the secrets of Dominic Savio was right from an early age. When he made his first communion, he made some promises to himself and to God. And one of the promises was, Jesus and Mary will be my friends. Here again, a young person who knows who to put at the centre of his life. And the last one that I'll mention just briefly is Saint Pedro Calungsod. Now, he lived a long time ago. He was born in 1654 and died in 1672, so he was 17. He was actually a martyr, but at 17. And he was martyred because he was a lay catechist. There may be people here who are lay catechists, people who help out, for example, with the children's liturgy on a Sunday morning. We know what we're talking about here. A 17-year-old who was engaged in the life of the church, and he was helping a priest baptise a mother and her baby who wanted to become Christians, and for that reason he was killed. These 6 or 7 people are just a tiny example of the extraordinary things that it's possible to do and to be when you're young. When St. John Bosco wrote the life story of Dominic Savio, he finished it up with a simple question. And he wrote this life story of Dominic Savio for the boys in his school. And the question was this: if he could do it, why can't you? So as you think of those 6 or 7 people, you might say to yourself, well, if they could do it, ordinary people, ordinary teenagers, ordinary young adults, if they could do it, why couldn't I? Now, I've known about Dominic Savio since I was a boy at a Salesian school myself, and I'm 63 and I still haven't managed it. So it's a little bit embarrassing for someone of my age. You've got a bit more going for you, you're much younger, but I want to throw that question out to you. If he could do it or she could do it, why couldn't I? Why couldn't I live an extraordinary life by living my ordinary life as well as I possibly can? And this is really the gift that you can bring as young people to the life of our church. And how do you do it? You do it by putting Christ back at your life and helping your youth group or your parish or your community to put Christ back at the heart of your community. Mary McKillop summed it all up, and those who were with us over at North Sydney the other day will remember me saying this. Mary McKillop once wrote to her sisters, and she said, whatever you're facing, whatever troubles, etc., remember who it is you're following. That's the secret to the renewed church that I was talking about. Remember who it is you're following. I'm going to finish in a minute because there might be some questions, so I'm going to jump over the other 50,000 slides that I prepared and go to the last one. So just you get a glimpse of them and see all the things that you're missing. Wouldn't you love to be listening to me talking about all these things? We're pretty close to the end. Let me just have a check here. So we go back to the original idea. The church is the community of the disciples of Christ. We know now what that means, disciples of Jesus. But there's a really interesting thing about Jesus, and it goes back to what I said right at the start. In the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, there's a phrase which has the story of Jesus, if you like. It's like a picture of Jesus. And it says this: I'm standing at your door knocking. And you might think of this almost as a prayer, that Jesus is saying to you through this festival, now as we're together, tonight at the big Mass in the Domain, I'm standing at the door knocking. If you open the door and invite me in, I'll sit down with you and I'll eat with you and you with me. Maybe that's the invitation of the youth festival. I'm at the door, I'm knocking. Will you open the door and let me in? And if you do, I'll sit down with you, and like friends, we'll share a meal together. If you open the door, if you let him in, then you will really become what the whole church needs you to be, and that is this gift of life and energy and discipleship that the young church can be for the whole church. So I'm going to stop there in case there are some questions. If there aren't, I'll come back to say one last thing. But if you want to ask any questions or make any comments, just stick up your hand and Chris will come running around with the microphone. Nobody, I've mesmerised you all. No? Well, I've got some bad news for you. It means I'm going to keep talking. I just want to share one last thought with you. There is a place, so I'm told, I haven't been there, in northern Italy, up in the mountains near Florence, where one of the most striking natural features is a species of fir tree or pine tree that grows there. And there are a couple of images there of it. I hopped on the internet. You can find anything on the internet, and found images of these particular trees in this particular forest area. The thing that's a bit unique about these trees is that they're very, very tall, sometimes maybe up to 30 or 40 metres. They stand very straight, as you can see, with quite thin trunks, and they have very few branches. If you walk outside later, there's a lot of pine trees around here as well. They have a lot of branches on them. These particular trees have very few branches. They also have very deep roots. And the reason for that is that they have to be able to dig deep in order to reach the moisture that's hidden in the soil in the very hot summers in that part of Italy. The trunks of the trees are very tall, but they're very slender, most of them. And that means that when the fierce winds blow in that part of Italy, they sway, they don't snap. And lastly, they have very few branches and very few pine needles on them, because in the winter, when it snows heavily, if there's too much foliage, the snow's going to settle on the foliage, break the branches, and the trees will eventually die. They're perfectly adapted, in other words, to their environment, a miracle of God's creation. I think that that forest and those trees are a kind of a parable or a symbol about what young people in the church need to be today. You're going to need to be able, like those trees, to go deep in order to get the moisture, the sustenance you need in order to survive at a time when it's difficult to be a member of the church. You're going to need to be flexible. not too rigid or unbending, because you're going to be bringing your faith into a world and into your circle of friends and all the rest of it who don't see things the way we might see them, who can't understand why you are interested in this God thing or this church thing. So you're going to need to know how to bend a little bit without breaking. And that's why also you're going to need to be really grounded in the earth. And lastly, you're going to have to focus on the essentials and not overload yourself with too much stuff that's not essential. So that when the pressure of your friends or society starts to come down on you, it doesn't become too much and the whole thing falls apart. So I think those trees in that mountain forest near Florence are, like I say, kind of a parable for what we as people in the church, and perhaps particularly young people in the church, are going to need in order to survive. Deep roots, strong trunks which know how to sway so that they don't break, and focusing on the things that really matter, the things that are essential, and let go some of the stuff that's not so essential. And of course, you'll know from listening to me this morning that, in my opinion, the one thing that's essential is Jesus. Jesus in his church, the church he's given to us as his gift to us, make that the centre of everything. And I think we have a fantastic future for the church, not just here in Australia, but everywhere.